What would you do if the person you trusted most humiliated you in public, then declared she should never have married you? I didn't scream. I didn't run. I'm an architect, and I design. For years, I built an archive of every betrayal. And when Claire crossed the final line, I set in motion a demolition as precise as any blueprint. This is my story. How silence became deadlier than rage, and how I dismantled a marriage piece by piece until only the truth remained. The rooftop bar glowed with that golden, flattering light that makes even the most exhausted architect feel like he belongs in a magazine spread. The city stretched around us, steel and glass shimmering under the last kiss of daylight, while strings of Edison bulbs hummed softly overhead. Claire had insisted on coming here, networking, she'd called it, though I'd started to notice that word had become her excuse for everything lately. I sat with a whiskey in hand, trying to appreciate the skyline, but my eyes kept returning to her. Claire, my wife of 7 years, the woman who once used to grip my arm like she'd fall off the world if she let go. Tonight she was leaning into another man, her laughter spilling out like champagne foam, effervescent, light, intoxicating. Jordan Miles, project manager at her firm. He wasn't remarkable, not taller than me, not sharper dressed, not even particularly handsome in the conventional sense, but he had something I hadn't seen in Claire's eyes in months. Undivided attention. I watched her hand linger on his forearm, as though the veins there carried secrets she wanted to trace. My chest tightened in that way jealousy sneaks in. Part heat, part shame. My rational brain told me to sip my drink, to play the aloof, accomplished husband. But my body betrayed me. I shifted forward, ears straining to catch her words. And then I heard it. The laugh, the lean in her voice, bright as broken glass. If I'd met you first, Jordan, I never would have married Daniel. The sentence landed like a wrecking ball. The kind of line you can't explain away as a joke, can't chalk up to one too many cocktails. My knuckles tightened around the glass. The condensation dripped onto my wrist, a cold reminder that I was still present, still visible, still the husband in the equation. Jordan chuckled, bashful, shaking his head. Come on, Claire, don't say that. But she did say it. She'd meant it enough to let it leave her lips. I felt something primal rise in me, a mix of humiliation and raw betrayal. The idea of anyone hearing her dismiss me like that, me, who had built a life with her, who had designed the very townhouse we lived in, burned worse than any insult. My jaw ached from the way I clenched it. I stood, my chair scraped across the wood deck, turning a few heads. Claire looked over, her face flushing, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features, like I was the one embarrassing her. Jordan's smile faltered. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. My fist connected with his cheek in a sharp, decisive arc. The sound was a dull crack against the backdrop of jazz and chatter. Glasses clinked. Someone gasped. Jordan stumbled back, clutching his face, his cocktail spilling down his shirt. Claire shrieked, her voice slicing through the night. Daniel, what the hell is wrong with you? What was wrong with me? The question echoed in my head, absurd in its simplicity. What was wrong with me was sitting across from her, laughing at jokes meant only for him, while my wife rewrote the story of our marriage in a single sentence. I straightened my jacket, my breath heavy, but my voice calm. Finish your drink, Claire. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for words, but none came. The crowd had gone quiet enough that the city traffic below seemed louder than the rooftop chatter. I walked away before she could recover, the taste of whiskey still bitter on my tongue. The elevator ride down was suffocating. I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. A man who looked like he had everything together, tailored suit, confident stance, yet whose life had just cracked open. My hand still buzzed from the punch, the knuckles already tender. Out on the street, the night air wrapped around me, cool and unfeeling. I should have felt guilt for what I'd done. Violence wasn't me. I was the planner, the builder, the man who thought 10 steps ahead. But in that moment, it wasn't guilt that filled me. It was clarity. Claire had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and I'd answered in the only language my pride had left. I walked aimlessly through the city for hours, the neon lights painting streaks across the pavement, the sound of her laughter replaying in my head. It wasn't just betrayal, it was mockery, and I couldn't be the butt of that joke anymore. By the time I returned home, dawn was threatening the horizon. Claire hadn't come back yet. Maybe she was still upstairs at the bar, tending to Jordan. Maybe she would stay with a friend. Maybe she was simply avoiding me. I didn't care. I poured myself another drink, sat in the silence of our meticulously curated living room, and let the weight of the night settle. The marriage we'd built was already shaking, but tonight it had cracked wide open. And deep down, a part of me already knew. The rooftop bar wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the first domino. The townhouse was silent when I pushed the door open. No trace of Claire. No perfume in the air. No heels kicked off by the door. Just emptiness. That suited me fine. The silence gave me space to breathe. I climbed the stairs and stood in the doorway of our bedroom. Correction, her bedroom now. My side of the bed looked like a stranger's corner, a carefully made stretch of fabric that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. Her side was rumpled, scented faintly of some expensive lotion she'd once made me drive across the city to buy. I opened the closet. Half my suit stared back at me, rows of tailored fabrics Claire had insisted I purchase to look the part. Armani, Zegna, Hugo Boss. Thousands of dollars of cloth I never asked for. I'd worn them to galas, to cocktail hours with her colleagues, to dinners where I was meant to be the accessory instead of the man. Tonight, those suits didn't matter. They were her trophies, not my skin. What did matter was the leather travel case at the top shelf, the one I bought in Milan years ago, the first trip Claire and I had taken after our wedding, when we still pretended we were invincible. I pulled it down, set it on the bed, and unzipped it. The packing began without drama. A stack of jeans, shirts I actually like wearing, shoes that fit my stride instead of hers. Then the essentials, passport, documents, the deed copies, bank papers I'd already gathered into a folder, and the watch. My mother's watch. The only inheritance she'd left me before cancer took her. A slim silver piece with a faint scratch along the clasp where she'd once dropped it in our driveway. Every time I looked at that watch, I remembered her telling me, "Daniel, never let anyone make you feel small. You build. That's what you do." I slipped it into the case carefully. That was staying with me. Always. The rest? Disposable. The suits, the ties, the curated furniture she demanded when we remodeled the townhouse last year, the sleek couch that had never been comfortable, the dining set she said made us look established. All of it was hers. If she wanted to build her little stage, she could keep the props. I opened the nightstand drawer and pulled out a photo album. Our wedding days stared back at me. Claire's smile wide, mine more hopeful than confident. I turned a page. Honeymoon in Santorini. Her in a white sundress, me holding her hand like it meant forever. I turned another page. Paris, rooftops, wine glasses clinking. Her eyes were bright in every shot. Mine were too, but I could see it now. She was always performing for the lens. I closed the album and slid it back into the drawer. Not worth packing. Memories aren't luggage. They weigh more than leather and fabric. Downstairs, I poured myself a drink and let the bourbon slide down like liquid armor. My eyes drifted over the furniture, the paintings she'd insisted we buy, the rug she claimed pulled the room together, all pieces of a life curated for appearances. None of it reflected the man who stood here now. I carried the case to the foyer and set it by the door. That was all I needed. Clothes, papers, the watch. Freedom. For a long time, I stood staring at the walls, waiting for guilt to creep in, for hesitation to paralyze me. It didn't. Instead, I felt a strange calm. Like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally exhaled. Claire would come home eventually, maybe flushed from wine, maybe from Jordan's cologne still clinging to her. She'd see the empty spaces in the closet, the missing case, and maybe for the first time realize that I was no longer just a silent provider she could humiliate at will. I wasn't running. I was reclaiming. I looked once more at the house I'd built with her demands ringing in my ears, then turned off the lights. The click of the lock behind me was quieter than I expected, but it carried finality. On the sidewalk, the cool night air felt cleaner than anything inside that townhouse. My case rolled beside me, wheels whispering across the concrete, the watch ticking steadily on my wrist. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just me clearing the stage. The office was mine in every sense of the word, not just the corner space I'd earned as a senior partner in the firm, but the sanctuary I had built away from Claire's curated stage. Dark with shelves lined the walls, filled with architectural monographs and models from projects I led, bridges, towers, lobbies carved into memory by concrete and glass. Here, everything was designed by my hand, not dictated by hers. I set the travel case by my desk and sat down, letting the silence swallow me. For years, this office had been where I retreated to breathe. Now it would be the command center for the war I'd never asked for but was fully prepared to fight. I reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out the lock steel box. A plain thing, matte black, with no markings to betray its contents. The key turned with a satisfying click. Inside, folders lay stacked with the precision of a courtroom exhibit. 3 years of humiliation, cataloged and preserved. The first folder held photographs. Claire at late-night work functions, her dress hem creeping higher the later the night ran. Snapshots of her leaning too close to men who weren't me, laughter painted across her lips. Some I'd taken myself after quietly following her. Others I'd obtained through more discreet means. Colleagues who owed me favors, contacts who knew how to find what wasn't meant to be found. The second folder contained receipts. Hotel charges that didn't match her calendar, bar tabs signed at hours she claimed to be asleep, boutique purchases she never wore in my presence. Each receipt was a breadcrumb and a trail she thought I'd never bother to follow. The third folder, my favorite, was audio, little recordings picked up from devices I'd placed in her car and in our home office. Nothing illegal, nothing overt, just enough to capture the careless words she thought floated into the void. Late-night calls where she complained about me to her friends. Offhand remarks about how she'd settled, about how I was dependable but boring. Words sharper than any blade. I placed each folder neatly on the desk, lining them up like soldiers awaiting orders. The intercom buzzed, startling me. My assistant's voice followed. "Mr. Harper, your sister is on line 2. I pressed a button. Put her through. Marissa's voice came, warm but edged with worry. "Daniel? I just got your message. What's going on? You sounded different." "I am different," I said. "It's time you knew." She hesitated. "Knew what?" I leaned back, staring at the skyline outside my window. For 3 years, I've been keeping track. Every slight, every betrayal, every laugh at my expense. I've been building a record. "Daniel," her tone shifted to alarm. "What are you saying? That Claire has been writing her own script, and I've been archiving it." I tapped the folders. "This isn't speculation. It's proof." There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. "I always thought something was off with her. But you never said anything." "Because strategy requires patience," I replied. "You don't confront until the structure is finished. You let the foundation cure, brick by brick, until it can bear the weight of the strike." "That's terrifying, Daniel," she whispered. "No, it's necessary." I explained the photos, the receipts, the recordings, how every humiliation had been quietly stored, every insult filed away, how I hadn't just endured, I had prepared. Marissa was quiet until I finished. Then she said, "So what now? You've got all this. But what do you plan to do with it?" I allowed myself a small smile. "That depends on Claire. But one thing's certain, she won't see it coming." "Daniel," her voice softened, "you sound cold, detached. Are you sure you're not losing yourself in this?" I looked down at the watch on my wrist, my mother's watch, the second hand ticking with steady inevitability. "I'm not losing myself," I said. "I'm reclaiming myself." We ended the call, and I sat alone with the archive spread before me. For years, I had been the dependable husband, the man Claire could take for granted. Tonight, staring at the evidence, I felt none of that weakness. Instead, I felt like the architect I truly was, not of buildings, but of something far more intricate, the dismantling of a life built on lies. I slid the folders back into the box, locked it, and placed the key in my pocket. The plan wasn't complete yet, but the archive was ready, and when the time came, it would speak louder than any fist ever could. I didn't sleep. I drafted, not buildings, contingencies. At 8:57 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from the courier. "On your stoop." I opened the townhouse doorcam feed. There she was, blurry at first and then painfully crisp. Claire, still in last night's sequin dress, hair loosened into a halo of static and bad decisions. Mascara mapped the places her laughter had cracked into something else around 3 a.m. She tugged at the hem like she could smooth the night flat with her palms. I timed everything to the minute. If you want to reclaim a story, you don't shout over the soundtrack. You change the track. The knock sounded through my phone's tiny speaker. She flinched, then straightened, the old performer snapping into place. I almost smiled. Even hungover, she reached for composure like a favorite necklace. The courier handed over a thick manila envelope, tamper strip still bright and smug. Claire signed without reading the label. "Harper, Claire, personal delivery, 9 a.m. She shut the door with her hip and walked out of the camera's frame. I let the feed run. Audio picking up the small domestic noises I used to love. The thunk of keys in the tray, the rustle of paper, the scrape of a chair. Our house had a way of turning the ordinary into ritual. This morning, the ritual was reckoning. Inside that envelope was an atlas of the life she didn't know I lived. Printouts of financial accounts, shells and subsidiaries, bore to anyone but me, numbers without poetry, except that they rhymed with power. A ledger of quiet moves, a silent stake in an engineering consultancy, an escrow vehicle with her name conspicuously absent. Accounts I'd moved months ago when her eyes started drifting across rooms as if searching for a better view. I hadn't hidden money out of spite. I'd reclassified trust as risk. The statements were neatly tabbed. Harper Holdings, capital commitments, Homestead Trust, asset freeze orders, Western Strategic, majority position. I wanted her to see the architecture control and understand that I'd never been as soft as she had hoped. Behind the statements came photographs. Not salacious. Precision, not porn. Claire at a hotel bar at 12:41 a.m., her hand laid lightly on a forearm that wasn't mine. Claire stepping into a ride share at 2:03, jacket open, the city's sodium lights grating her skin to bronze. Claire in a conference room after hours, chin tipped toward a man whose attention was a mirror she couldn't stop checking. There were receipts, too, the banal breadcrumbs. 2 drinks charged to a room I wasn't in, a boutique purchase timed perfectly between a late strategy session and the first morning train. Finally, there was the USB drive, matte black, labeled in white ink. For Claire, from D. I could picture the way her thumb would have moved over those words, testing for warmth like a kid at a campfire. I'd left a note on top of the drive. Plug into the television. Press play. I clicked the feed to audio only, and let her have the privacy of her own face. There are some expressions a husband doesn't need as souvenirs. Instead, I stared through my office windows at a skyline I'd helped design, and thought about the first time I'd ever seen Claire undone. Not like this. Not mascara and a hangover. The other undone. Hair wet from a summer storm. Dress clinging. Hands on my tie in the back of the cab, because patience had been ruined by the rain. Sex for us used to be the opposite of performance. It was the one place she didn't act. I'd built a home on that assumption, that when the doors closed, we were honest. Maybe that was my naivete, my favorite one. When the bar receipts started stacking up, when networking turned into choreography, I stopped asking for things I already knew. I told myself restraint was dignity. The truth is, restraint was planning. I learned the slope of her schedules, the cadence of her lies, and the blind spots in the attention she craved. Jordan wasn't a revelation. He was a symptom with a business card. The rooftop line, if I'd met you first, was just her saying out loud what she'd been rehearsing for months in smaller, sharper ways. The chair scraped again over speaker. A breath. Paper rustled in a hurry now. Urgency replacing poise. I pictured her hands. A pianist's hands. Capable, decisive. Gripping the records the way she used to grip my shoulders when we were new. Attraction had once been gravity with us. Even grocery store produce aisles could tip us into each other. These days, if we brushed in the hallway, she recoiled like I was an outlet she hadn't asked to touch. Withholding had become her narcotic. She liked watching me detox on proximity. I poured coffee from the carafe in my office and let its bitterness explain the morning to my mouth. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was design. A change order stamped and filed. When you discover a load-bearing lie, you either shore the structure or you bring it down in a controlled collapse. The envelope was controlled collapse. I'd imagined she might call, but the phone stayed silent. Pride is louder than panic until the floor moves. I hoped she'd read each tab slowly. I hoped she'd feel the math in her teeth. Those accounts funded lives she hadn't bothered to learn about, mine included. They also funded an engineering consultancy whose project manager liked leaning into married women at rooftop bars. If Chapter 5 of the story had a title card, it would read, Consequences are kind of math, too. The house microphone picked up the soft clack of the TV remote. She'd reached the USB. I set my cup down. For a second, I considered closing the app, letting the rest of the morning pass without witness. But some wounds want their own audit trail. Audio won't betray the expressions I promised not to keep. She exhaled, long, shaky, and then the television startup chime chimed. I imagined her mouth flattening. She always did that when she was bracing. I pictured her on the edge of the couch we bought because it photographed, well, the same couch where, years earlier, she'd pull me down laughing, thighs bracketing my hips while rain hammered the windows. She'd whisper mine against my throat, like a vowel. I believe her then because vowels are architecture. 2. You only know the fault lines after weather. I spoke over her living room speakers, the video cued to my cleanest light. "Good morning, Claire." My voice was calm enough to scare me. "You want to watch this through?" I paused in the recording there, on purpose, so she could decide whether obedience would feel like agency. Then the presentation began. The shell companies untangled, the consultancy ownership chart, the terms I'd renegotiated last quarter when I saw where her eyes had migrated. I didn't say Jordan's name yet. I wanted her to ask it in her head and feel the echo. By the time the playback finished its first minute, I closed the feed and silenced my phone. She could have the room to meet the truth without me watching her swallow. Some mercies are for me as much as for the other person. I zipped my travel case and slid it under my desk. The watch on my wrist ticked steadily, my mother's scratch cold against my skin. Buildings fail slowly, then all at once. So do marriages. The morning knock was just a fire marshal at the door with the final inspection. "Press play, Claire. Then call whoever you want. I've already decided what the rest of the day looks like." The USB drive was more than a delivery system. It was a scalpel. I'd rehearsed every word, filmed under deliberate lighting. No shadows, no excuses. When Claire pressed play, she wouldn't just see me. She'd see the man she never thought existed inside the husband she dismissed. The screen flickered, and there I was, seated at my office desk, suit jacket buttoned, voice calm as if I were presenting to a boardroom instead of detonating a marriage. "Good morning, Claire." My recorded self began. If you're watching this, you've already seen the envelope. You've pieced together the numbers, the accounts, the photographs. Now it's time you understand the full scope. Her living room filled with the sound of my voice, level and deliberate, almost surgical. "I'm not just your husband, Claire. I'm the silent partner in an investment consortium that funds multiple engineering consultancies. One of those firms happens to be your company's main contractor. And as of yesterday, Jordan Miles's termination paperwork has been filed." I let the pause sit. In the recording, my face didn't gloat, didn't twitch. Just business. By the time you call him, he'll already know. His access revoked, his career trajectory stalled before it began. You wanted excitement, Claire. You found in a man whose paycheck depended, indirectly, on me. That's the irony you never saw. I could almost hear her breath catching through the feed. I imagined her clutching the remote tighter. Mascara still cracked under her eyes from last night. The recording continued. "I've tolerated years of humiliations. Your jokes at my expense, your late nights dressed with someone else's gaze, your derision when I asked for the simplest affection. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I documented. Every receipt, every overheard conversation, every slip you thought vanished into the air. It all found a place in the archive. You see, Claire, I'm an architect. And architects don't destroy without design. They dismantle with precision. On the video, I leaned forward, elbows on the desk, tones sharpening without raising volume. What you mistook for passivity was patience. What you mistook for safety was calculation. You believed I was a man who'd absorb every slight. You were wrong. I had included visuals, charts of corporate structures, highlighting Jordan's firm, its funding routes, the way my consortium held silent power. It wasn't for intimidation. It was proof. Proof that my reach extended beyond the walls of our townhouse, beyond rooftop bars where you could laugh at me in public. The recording cut briefly to a slide of Jordan's HR file. Confidential, stamped, final. Then back to me. You declared, in front of strangers, that if you'd met him first, you'd never have married me. Tonight, those strangers may not remember my punch, but they'll remember your words. And tomorrow, you'll watch what those words cost. Not just in reputation, but in livelihood. Jordan will survive, perhaps, but not in your orbit, not in the way you imagined. I'd scripted it carefully. No shouting, no venom. Just measured betrayal turned into mathematics. Then came the closer. I don't hate you, Claire. Hate would mean I still let you occupy my heart. What I feel now is colder, cleaner. You're free to chase the thrill you craved. But know this. Every structure has a foundation, and you just learned mine was never as fragile as you believed. The screen froze on my face, then faded to black. I didn't watch her finish it. I didn't need to. The power wasn't her reaction. It was in the shift, the tectonic movement of her realizing I wasn't a man she'd rewritten in her head. I was the one holding the pen. Somewhere, her phone would already be buzzing. Jordan, panicked, confused, wondering why his badge didn't work, why his inbox was disabled. Claire would try to console him, maybe even promise they'd figure out together. But behind her, The USB sat like a detonator she couldn't disarm. In my office, I poured a glass of water, not whiskey. My hand was steady. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt lighter, not victorious, not vindictive, just free. When I first caught her laughter on another man's arm, I thought rage would define me. But no, strategy defined me. She'd expected an explosion, messy and emotional. What she got was demolition, measured and clean. By noon, the city would be talking. By evening, Claire would no longer be a woman admired for her poise at work functions. She'd be the subject of whispers, her lover unemployed, her own footing suddenly unstable. I closed my laptop and set the travel case by the door. The morning had passed. The confession had landed. The rest would unfold like dominoes I'd set in motion years ago. The screen was black now in her living room, but my voice would still be echoing, calm, precise, unrelenting. A husband she never truly knew, until it was far too late. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline, the first domino had fallen. Jordan Miles was walked out of his office at 3:15 p.m., a cardboard box in his arms, security badges dangling uselessly from his pocket. The consultancy didn't do drama. They did efficiency. HR read from prepared script, shook their heads at his protests, and turned his access cards cold. I didn't have to be there to watch it. My contacts sent me the updates in real time. One even sent a blurry phone photo. Jordan's jaw set in anger, his eyes darting around like a man who just realized the floor wasn't under him anymore. I saved the photo, not out of malice, but as documentation, proof that the chain reaction had begun. At 4:02, my phone buzzed again. Claire called Jordan 12 times in under an hour. At 4:30, she finally reached him. I didn't need the transcript to know how that conversation went. She would have started with panic. Oh my God, what happened? Then try to pivot to outrage. He'd be defensive, embarrassed, maybe even blaming her. Lovers don't weather storms well when the roof collapses that fast. By evening, my accounts had done their work. Joint credit cards declined. The safe cushions she thought were ours? Frozen. My bank systems processing orders with mechanical precision. Claire tried buying groceries at 6:15. The charge failed. By 7 o'clock, she was on the phone with the bank, her voice dripping with disbelief, demanding answers she wasn't going to like. I imagined her pacing the kitchen, phone pressed her ear, still in yesterday's dress, still reeling from the USB, the marble counter she'd insisted on, the designer cabinets. None of it could save her from the math that now defined her life. Jordan, meanwhile, sent 3 frantic texts to her, blurred screenshots forwarded to me through my channels. They blindsided me. Somebody high up must have pulled strings. I'm ruined, Claire. She replied, desperate, her words clumsy. We'll figure out. I'll help you. Just breathe. But how could she help when her own accounts were turning into locked vaults? At 8 o'clock, she tried calling me. Once. Twice. Then again. I let the phone buzz. Each time her name lit up the screen, I felt the same cold clarity. I wasn't ignoring her out of spite. I was teaching her silence. For years, she treated mine as weakness. Now it was a weapon sharper than any insult. By 9 o'clock, Marissa called to check in. You've set all in motion, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. And it's only day 1. She hesitated. How do you feel? I glanced at the travel case by my desk, the watch ticking steadily on my wrist. Lighter, I said, like I'm finally standing on my own foundation. Meanwhile, the whispers had begun. A contact at Claire's firm messaged me. People are talking about the rooftop bar. Word spreading. A blurry photo of me with my fist mid-swing was already circulating online. Not glamorous, not flattering, but effective. The narrative wasn't about my violence. It was about why. About what Claire had said. Her words were now public currency. Traded in forums, muttered in office corridors. By midnight, Claire sat in the ruins of her curated life. Her lover unemployed, her cards frozen, her reputation unraveling thread by thread. She had tried to reach me 7 times. Each call unanswered. I poured myself one final drink and stood by the window, watching the city breathe. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation. She had played me for the dull, dependable man who would absorb her games. Tonight, she learned the truth. The dependable man had always been building an exit. The fallout wasn't over. It was only beginning. And tomorrow, when the dust settled, she'd realize the house she thought she controlled had already collapsed into mine. The knock came at 8:30 a.m., sharp and businesslike. Not the frantic pounding of a lover, not the pleading fist of a desperate spouse, just the efficient rap of a man with a job to do. Claire shuffled to the door, hair still damp from a shower, wrapped in the silk robe she always claimed was too delicate to actually wear. She opened it to find a process server in a navy suit, envelope in hand. "Claire Harper?" he asked. She blinked, nodded. "You've been served." The papers landed in her hand with the same weight as a gavel. The server turned and left without ceremony. The door clicked shut, and Claire stood in our polished entryway, staring at the embossed lettering like it might burn her skin. I was at my office, sipping coffee, when my phone lit up with her call. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to hear her voice. God, there was a time when her voice meant home, but because this was the moment I had been designing toward. The silence wasn't cruelty. It was architecture. The prenuptial agreement, the one she'd laughed at years ago, lay spelled out in those papers with cold precision. She'd called a formality, a box to tick. She'd waved me off when I'd insisted we keep it ironclad. "You're so cautious, Daniel, always preparing for things that will never happen." And now here it was happening. She left with her car, a modest savings account, just enough to avoid destitution, but nowhere near the lifestyle she'd grown drunk on. No townhouse, no curated furniture, no tailored suits she once demanded I buy to look the part. The prenup was merciless in its simplicity. What was mine stayed mine. What was hers remained hers. For years she dismissed it as paranoia. Today it was her cage. By noon, she was calling again. I pictured her pacing the kitchen, stacks of legal paper on the counter, coffee untouched. Her nails would be tapping the granite, a rhythm of panic disguised as thought. I remember when those hands had once only tapped against my chest after sex, playing an absent-minded rhythm against my heartbeat. She used to say it was her way of listening to me, without words. That intimacy was a lifetime ago. Now those same fingers fumble for solutions. Lawyers, friends, anyone who might throw her a rope. But ropes fray when they're cut against stone. I sat back in my chair, staring at the skyline, and let myself remember the night she'd first called me boring. We'd been at dinner with her friends, wine flowing too freely. She'd laughed and said I was safe, dependable, the kind of guy you marry when you're tired of excitement. The table had erupted, and I'd smiled through it. Safe, dependable. Translation, invisible. This morning, the joke had expired. By mid-afternoon, Claire tried a different tactic. She emailed me, "We can talk about this, Daniel. We don't need lawyers. Let's be civil." Civil. After years of casual cruelty dressed as banter. After rooftop humiliations and whispered phone calls. Now she wanted civility. I drafted a reply, then deleted it. She didn't deserve my words anymore. My silence would teach her more than any paragraph. By evening, I heard from Marissa. She'd checked in on Claire at my request, not out of sympathy, but as reconnaissance. "She's rattled," my sister said. "Keep saying this isn't fair, that you've blindsided her." "Fair," I echoed. The word tasted bitter. She thought fair meant she could rewrite the rules whenever it suited her. Marissa was quiet for a moment. Then, "Daniel, you really don't love her anymore, do you?" I thought about it carefully. Love had once been mornings tangled in sheets, laughter spilling out before coffee. It had been her hair damp with rain, her lips pressed to mine in the back of a cab. But love had eroded, ground down by neglect, by disdain, by the way she stopped meeting my eyes long before she met Jordan's. "No," I said finally, "I don't." Claire had her papers now. She had her cage, drawn in black ink and notarized seal. And me? I had my freedom signed and delivered. I poured myself a drink that night, alone in my office, the city lights stretching like veins across the dark. Tomorrow would bring gossip, judgment, maybe even regret. But tonight, I allowed myself the smallest smile. The dependable man had finally stopped carrying the weight of someone else's performance. He'd handed it back to her, wrapped in legal paper, stamped with finality, served. The city has a way of amplifying whispers. A story told once in a rooftop bar becomes gospel by the time it crosses 3 office buildings and a dozen wine glasses. By the end of that week, Claire's name was threaded into conversations she couldn't escape. It began with the rooftop photos, grainy but clear enough. Me, jaw set, fist mid-swing. Jordan, stumbling back, a cocktail staining his shirt. And Claire, frozen between us, mouth half open, caught in the flash of someone's phone. The image spread through the usual gossip channels first. Industry forums, social threads, even the kind of blogs that thrive on scandal. What started as curiosity turned into judgment. The caption under most of those posts wasn't about my punch. It was about her words. If I'd met you first, Jordan, I never would have married Daniel. Strangers chewed on it like gristle, debating whether it was reckless flirting or something sharper. But in every version, Claire came out looking small. The city had crowned her queen of derision, and now they were enjoying the sight of her crown toppling. At her agency, the fallout was immediate. Colleagues who once circled her like satellites now whispered in corners. She'd walk into a meeting room and feel conversations cut short, eyes flickering to her and then away. The rooftop bar wasn't just a scandal. It was an unmasking. The poised executive, the woman who spoke about branding with perfect diction, was now the subject of her own ruined narrative. And then there was Jordan. His career didn't survive the week. Word of his termination spread quickly, and though no one spoke my name, the timing was obvious. Claire tried to defend him. But how do you defend a man who lost his job in the exact moment he was caught laughing at another man's marriage? He became a liability she couldn't cling to publicly. She went from mistress to martyr overnight, but no one was buying tickets to that show. I, on the other hand, didn't retreat. I attended 2 industry galas in that same span of days. Not alone, never alone, but with Elena Ruiz, a litigation attorney whose sharpness was matched only by her poise. Elena wasn't a replacement, and I didn't parade her like a trophy. We simply arrived together, spoke easily, and let the cameras do what they always do. The city noticed. The same forums that dissected Claire's humiliation now compared her to Elena. Where Claire had been captured mid-sneer or mid-laugh, Elena appeared collected, her hand brushing my arm in ways that spoke of trust, not desperation. She looked at me the way Claire once had, back when love was still new, and maybe that was enough to make the contrast unbearable for her. One morning, Marissa forwarded me a thread, a photo of Elena and me at the gala, glasses raised, both smiling. Beneath it, a comment. No wonder Claire's spiraling. He traded up. I didn't endorse it, didn't even smile at it, but the truth was there. Perception had flipped. Claire wasn't a dazzling woman with a dependable husband anymore. She was the one who lost both her lover and her status in the same week. Meanwhile, her calls to me dwindled. At first, a storm, daily, hourly, a mix of anger and pleading. Then silence. Not peace, just absence. I imagine her lying awake in that townhouse, scrolling through articles, seeing her own name dissected by strangers. I wondered if she replayed the rooftop moment in her head. Not the punch, but her own words, realizing too late that they had been the real weapon. For me, reputation was never performance. I'd built mine on blueprints and steel, not rooftop gossip. So while she fought shadows, I stood under chandeliers, shaking hands, introducing Elena to people who respected me enough not to ask about Claire. They knew better. They knew the story wasn't hers to tell anymore. One night, as I left the gala with Elena's arm hooked in mine, a photographer called out, "Mr. Harper, any comment on your wife?" I didn't break stride. Ex-wife, I corrected, and that was all I said. By the time we reached the car, I felt the weight lift a little more. The city could gnaw on Claire's story all it wanted. I wasn't in it anymore. Reputation is fragile, but it's also renewable. Claire had gambled hers on charm and spectacle. I'd rebuilt mine on silence and precision. And now, as the city turned its gaze toward me and Elena, I realized something that had eluded me for years. I wasn't invisible. I had simply been waiting for the right time to step back into the light. For Claire, the whispers would only grow sharper. For me, the noise faded into background music. And for the first time in years, I didn't mind being seen. The ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold, chandeliers catching every shimmer of silk and sequins. Conversations rose and fell like waves, punctuated by the clink of champagne flutes. Elena's arm rested lightly in mine as we stepped inside, her poise drawing eyes that once might have turned toward Claire. I wasn't surprised when I saw Claire near the entrance. She dressed apart, emerald gown, hair swept into perfect curls, lips painted the shade of ambition. But there was something brittle in the way she held her glass, like it might shatter if she gripped it any tighter. Our eyes met. For the first time in weeks, she was in front of me, not through whispers or photographs. And of course, she couldn't resist the confrontation. "Daniel," she said, voice sharp as crystal, "we need to talk." Elena glanced at me, but I shook my head gently. "Claire," I replied, calm as marble, "we don't." That only fueled her. "You think you can just erase me?" "Parade around with her." She flicked her eyes toward Elena. And act like none of this matters? I kept my voice even. It doesn't matter anymore. The divorce was finalized days ago. Her mask cracked. For a moment, the poise faltered, replaced by raw disbelief. Finalized? Without me knowing? You knew enough, I said. You had counsel. You signed. You chose not to read the fine print because fine print bored you. The crowd had started to notice. Conversations dulled. Eyes turned. Claire thrived on spectacle once, but tonight the spotlight burned. You can't just, she started, but I cut in measured, deliberate. Claire, you built a stage on mockery and affairs. I dismantled it. Now you're standing in the rubble, trying to claw your way back up, but there's nothing left to climb. Elena stayed composed, letting me handle it. That restraint, that quiet strength. It contrasted so violently with Claire's desperation that the entire room felt the difference. Claire's laugh came sharp, brittle. Do you really think she sees you for who you are? Safe, predictable, boring Daniel. Elena finally spoke, her voice low but unwavering. I see him, Claire. I see a man who doesn't need to humiliate his partner to feel alive. The silence that followed was louder than shouting. Claire's hand trembled around her glass, wine sloshing dangerously near the rim. She searched for words, but nothing came. I leaned in just enough for her to hear. My tone, private though the moment was anything but. I donated tonight. In your name. Her eyes widened. What? 6 figures. I said smoothly, to the foundation hosting this gala. The announcement will be made before dinner. It landed like a blow. If she protested, she'd look ungrateful. If she smiled, she'd look dependent. Either way, she was trapped in a narrative she couldn't control. Her voice dropped, desperate now. Why are you doing this to me? Because, I said, you already did it to yourself. I turned, offered my arm back to Elena. She accepted without hesitation, and together we walked away. Behind us, Claire stood frozen in her emerald gown, the queen of a court that no longer existed. Minutes later, the announcement came. The MC thanked Claire Harper for her generous donation. Applause filled the room. Claire's face went red beneath the chandelier light, trapped between pride and humiliation. I didn't look back. Not once. For years, I'd been her backdrop. The dependable husband, the silent figure. Tonight, I became a man who walked away with his head high, while she was left in the ruins of her own design. As Elena's laughter brushed against my ear, soft and genuine, I realized I no longer carried the weight of Claire's betrayal. The confrontation was hers to endure, not mine. The gala carried on, music swelling, glasses clinking, the city spinning around us. And for the first time in years, I wasn't watching from the sidelines. I was living. 3 months is not a long time on paper, but grief and freedom both warp clocks in strange ways. To Claire, those 90 days must have stretched like years. To me, they passed with the rhythm of a man learning to breathe again. She lived now in a modest apartment above a noisy street, boxes stacked like monuments to what she had lost. Neighbors complained about the music from the bar downstairs. Her once curated life was reduced to secondhand furniture and thin walls. She kept a car, the savings account permitted by the prenup, but little else. I heard she rarely unpacked, as if refusing to admit permanence. Meanwhile, I had moved forward. Elena and I hiked on weekends, laughed over burnt attempts at new recipes, found small joys in quiet. She wasn't a savior. I never wanted one. But she reminded me of the man I was before Claire's shadow stretched too far across my life. With Elena, my silence wasn't weakness, it was space, and she filled it with warmth instead of contempt. Claire scrolled through our past, or so I heard, old wedding photos, anniversaries preserved on her phone, fragments of a life she had chipped away at until only regrets remained. One evening, Marissa told me she'd seen Claire at the grocery store. No heels, no laughter, just a cart filled with frozen dinners and a stare locked on the ground. She looked small, Marissa said. I didn't ask for more. In her apartment, I imagined her replaying the rooftop bar again and again, the way her voice had rung out. If I'd met you first, Jordan, I never would have married Daniel. At the time, she must have thought it clever, dangerous, even intoxicating. Now it must echo like a curse, a single sentence that detonated everything she once thought permanent. Jordan, last I heard, had moved on. Another city, another consultancy, far from Claire's orbit. He'd stopped answering her calls weeks after the fallout. His ambition couldn't afford her baggage. Lovers built on adrenaline rarely survive the quiet that follows. And Claire was left with the quiet. A quiet I used to know, the silence of being unseen by the person you love. But now she sat in it alone, staring at photographs of the man who had once been her home. I didn't revel in it. Vengeance had been precise, not indulgent. I didn't need to linger over her collapse. The architecture had done its job. Her lies dismantled, her illusions stripped, her throne dissolved into dust. What lingered for me wasn't triumph. It was clarity. I hadn't changed. I was still the architect. Still the man who built with patience, who believed foundations mattered more than facades. Claire had mistaken patience for fragility. That was her downfall, not mine. One night, I sat on my balcony with Elena, the city lights glittering around us. She asked me if I ever missed Claire. I thought about it honestly. I miss who she was, I said, not who she became. Elena didn't push. She simply leaned her head against my shoulder, her silence respectful, not punitive. It struck me then how rare that was, being allowed to exist without being diminished. In Claire's apartment, I imagined her opening another bottle of cheap wine, scrolling again, trying to map how a life can collapse so thoroughly in such little time. But the truth was simple. It hadn't collapsed in months. It had eroded for years, each laugh at my expense, each night of withholding, each betrayal she thought disappeared into the air. By the time the rooftop bar arrived, she wasn't detonating our marriage. She was just acknowledging it was already gone. 3 months later, I no longer wondered what she was doing. She wasn't my story anymore. She was just a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, a name attached to gossip, a reminder that even the brightest facade can crack if built on mockery instead of respect. The aftermath wasn't about her ruin. It was about my rebirth. I hadn't changed who I was. I had remembered. And as Elena laughed softly beside me, her hand finding mine in the glow of the city, I realized a truth that had taken me years to learn. Love isn't about performance or spectacle. It's about choosing someone who doesn't mistake your silence for weakness, but for strength. Claire would spend years chasing what she'd lost. I only had to look forward.